I think that actually the communication of Joe Biden and the way that he presented himself and his team presented him did him no favors in the long run. Yes, the operation was sophisticated at the White House, but just in terms of the communication, I think, when we were talking about this episode, Lewis, we were talking about, what are the clips, and our editors came up with a kind of list of things. They're invariably Biden gaffes where he hasn't said something quite right. He's got it wrong, and people have just said, "Oh, can't you express this better?" And that, of course, came to its absolute culmination in the CNN debate at the end of June, where the one and only debate he had against Donald Trump, which effectively sealed his fate.
Make sure that all those things we need to do, child care, elder care, making sure that we continue to strengthen our healthcare system, making sure that we're able to make every single solitary person eligible for what I've been able to do with the with the COVID. With dealing with everything we have to do with. Look, if we finally beat Medicare.
God, I mean, even listening back to it now, it's so, again, I go back to that word. There is a tragedy to it. There is a tragedy to it. And I do think, John, I think two things about this. One, I think you're absolutely right. I think that the communications around Biden, I mean, that can make it sound sort of flippant or facile in some way. It's not that. An American president has to be able to draw the dots of his presidency, to create a narrative of his presidency, of being able to explain to the American public what it is that he is doing, especially in a media environment which is so fractured, and where you have an opponent, because Trump, this is what's extraordinary about Trump, right? He haunts the Biden presidency as well. It's not like he's gone away during any of this period. He's still on the stage the entire time, weaving his own narrative day after day, strong, which he always does. And Biden, particularly as time proceeded, and I think what's even sad as well, you can see when we're looking through the sort of early clips, you can already see a kind of a completely, or not completely, but somewhat different Biden, even in those early days, in terms of his ability to articulate what he's doing. So if we go to those signature initiatives, for example, like we talked about, the IRA, the American Rescue Plan, the Infrastructure Act, the CHIPS Act, all signature stuff, all big stuff, all historic stuff. But did the American public really understand what they were about, what were the links between them, why they were good for them as opposed to good for Joe Biden and his legacy? Not always. And a lot of that sat with Biden's inability, to be honest, and an ability that got worse and worse over time to articulate what he was doing and why in clear, crisp, simple terms.
Yeah. The thing about Biden, I kind of, when he was president, I went to Milwaukee with him on a trip on, kind of there and back on Air Force One, and he's doing a town hall meeting, and he's wonderful with the audience, empathetic and kind of kind and decent. Actually, he was also a very chippy person. He felt he'd always been underestimated. He always felt that people had sort of sneered at him, that he hadn't had an Ivy League education like so many others that have, kind of risen to the top of the Democratic Party. And he felt that kind of no one really appreciated him. And I just kind of can't help thinking that a part of this tragedy in him was his stubborn belief that only he could fight Trump in a second term, and stayed on until way, way too late. Impossible. I mean, maybe there are all sorts of areas where Kamala Harris should have done the campaign differently. But I still think overwhelmingly, she just did not have the time to define herself. She didn't have the time to do it. And because Biden had left it so late, it was impossible, in a sense, for it to be anyone other than Kamala Harris as the Democratic torchbearer. If he had done what LBJ had done in '68, which was to give a few more months for the Democratic Party to choose who its candidate should be, then maybe it would have been different. But I just think that, that bit of his legacy, we're absolutely right to talk up all the legislative achievements which will have a long-lasting effect. One other long-lasting effect I just should mention, I think he's appointed something like 200 or 300 federal judges in the time that he has been president, and that will have a very lasting effect on the decisions that are made in the courts, because the courts do divide whether they are conservative or liberal.
Yeah, but as you say, John, you cannot set, and I think this will be obviously one of history's judgments that is inescapable, you cannot set the essay question for your presidency to be exercising MAGAism to protect the Republic from its return, and then for it to return on your watch. It can only be described as a failure, because he ended up being the only man who could defeat MAGAism in 2020 and was the handmaiden, absolutely the handmaiden to MAGAism's return in 2024 because of the decisions he made. And one other thing as well, and I think this will also influence how his presidency is seen, and we can't know this yet because we just do not have access to the documents. We don't have access, people haven't spoken candidly about it, but in time they will. The question of the cover-up about Biden's decline, I think, will be central, because it will be there for historians to see. We've all seen it, obviously reaching its apogee in that moment, in that debate. Historians will ponder the extent to which Biden was in control of his own presidency and his administration, particularly in the latter stages, and the extent to which senior Democratic officials, including Kamala Harris, were aware of his decline and what they did to try and arrest it, and also to try and do something about it in terms of the succession. And we will know far more about that. And I do think that was a big understated part of the Democrats' loss in 2024. I do think a lot of Americans felt that they had been misled. They could see that they had been misled. This was an administration and his officials that said day after day, week after week, the president's fine. He's the strongest person in the room. He's the most articulate person in the room. He always has the right question. All this stuff that then looked facile. And that was the thing, right? And this was what was such a gift to Trump. Trump's whole message always is, these elites are lying to you the entire time. Yeah, maybe I lie, but at least I don't pretend I don't lie, right? And for an administration that was predicated on the idea of restoring dignity and earnestness and honesty to government, I really think that was completely lethal.
Yes, there was such a dramatic mismatch between what everyone could see with their own eyes. I had my own. I remember bumping into Biden at the G7 summit in Cornwall, and he was there, and he came and sat at. I was with the British ambassador to Washington at a bar, and Biden and Jill Biden come and sit at the next table, and he just looked absolutely spent and shot, and was looking out into the mid distance and kind of looked away with the fairies. There is a mismatch, undoubtedly, between what the American people saw and felt and what was being said in Washington and what was being publicly spoken about by the administration.
The Newsagents. This is a Global Player original podcast.